Hi, this is Marguerite sharing a memory book. This is a book I made using techniques for making a junk journal. I was inspired to make this after I saw a video posted from Ephemera's Vintage Garden. Debbie Ann did a project where she used an altered book and filled it with illustrations, images, and things like lace and buttons and other sewing related items, and just collaged some really amazing spreads. When I saw that, I was inspired because I have a whole collection of things that belong to my grandmother, and she was sewing her entire life, and so I didn't quite know what to do with these things. And after I saw that video, it kind of a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, oh, this is a great way to use up some of those things so that I have them in a collection that I put together for her. So this book is dedicated to my grandmother, Margaret, and it's kind of I use paper sources or sources of things from several different sources. For example, I used things, as many vintage things I could find, like music paper, maps, and these transfers are sewing transfers that were part of her collection. I used some lace that she kept, and buttons that she had, a ton of buttons. So I just kind of, and then I also used some paper sources from Ephemera's Vintage Garden printouts as well. So I took a book and tore out the inside, and then used the spine and, well, the covers to sew my signatures into. For this, I used 4 signatures, and each signature has 4 pages. So when you fold those in half, it becomes 8 front and back. So 8 times 4 is 32. So 32, it's quite a lot to fill, but I did over several months. What I did in the beginning was I wrote my own kind of memories or thoughts about my grandmother, because inside I didn't write anything. There is no writing inside. It's just all collaged. So I spent the time to write and talk a little bit about her life and why she was important to me and why she was interesting and some of the things that she shared with me over the years, so on and so forth. And I just kind of left that as a little kind of book introduction in the beginning. Everything's very plain as usual. My signature really is plain. I don't really like a whole lot of adornment, so I kept even the insides very plain. I might add something here, but I'm not quite sure yet. So anyway, here's my first spread. I did add photos of my grandmother, ones that I had. It just kind of, worked out that way better, kind of make it more illustrative. So I used her embroidery threads and pulled off, stickers and things as I needed them, where I needed them. These things were these buttons, and this was in her stash, and I actually did this page so the button would fall right in between. Of course, I'm trying to keep the pages as thin as possible because it did get rather bulky rather fast. This was hers, embroidery guide. This I got somewhere on Etsy. I made this little pocket just using, this is some paper pad. Here's again another embroidery transfer. Here is a buckle that was in her collection of things, and I just put a ordinary ribbon on that. Ephemera's Vintage Garden. I shared the same name as my grandmother for 33 years before I got married. So that was another thing that we had in common. So that was just an envelope from one of the letters that I sent her while I was living abroad. This receipt for Eastman Kodak Stores was in her stash of things, and that that was really cool. I like that. So it goes along with the photo. This is Ephemera's Vintage Garden, which I stuck a canceled stamp onto. This is an old map, and I did a little bit of punching with eyelets. Put some eyelets in there and some string just for decoration. Here's more transfer paper. Here's another picture of my grandmother and her sisters and some friends during a wedding. And then I just used some rickrack, some decorative elements here. This was a napkin that I sewed. I did some sewing into the pages, not a whole lot. It's kind of fussy, and well, this does have has a sewing theme, so of course I did want to do some sewing into it. I sewed the napkin onto the page itself, and that, of course, you have to plan ahead. You know, before you tie in your signatures, you know, you can sew directly onto the paper. I did not care for how the sewing looked on the back, and so that's fine when I taped it or put down, you know, something so that the sewing was covered up. But I discovered that I like it better when I sew a napkin onto a piece of cardstock first, and then I glue it into the book. That just works better. With this napkin, it has several layers, and if you just tear off the very, very top layer, it will tear pretty easily. So I kept the three layers of paper, and I also wanted it to have a little texture, to be a little bit puffy. One thing you need to do before you can start sewing is take a little bit of double-sided tape and fasten or adhere the napkin onto the paper first, the cardstock first. Because if you start sewing without it adhered, it's going to bunch and it's going to get ugly. This bunched a tiny little bit. It's actually not bad, but I've done it before and it's just a mess if you don't, you know, make sure that your napkin is stuck onto your paper source first. So that's that. This is what it looks like on the other side, and as I said, I'm kind of not really crazy about that. It just does not look very pretty. So I'd rather just do it on a piece of cardstock first and then glue it into whatever I'm working on. So that's what I did here. This was a transfer that I put matte medium and glued it onto a piece of cardstock, and then I sewed around it and then put it in with double-sided tape in here, so it's not actually sewn into the book but just attached with double-sided tape. So this is just a little pocket. Okay, so this is a spread that took me 2 hours to do, and the reason why I'm mentioning that is because don't feel bad if it takes you a long time to come up with ideas of something that's going to work. Sometimes they flow, it comes together very easily. Other times it's a real struggle to find something that works, or, you know, pieces of paper and illustrations and images that all go together. So this one I used eyelets on the bottom, and I sewed it with some embroidery thread, and I used a little button to kind of finish it off down here. More buttons. These are buttons that I bought, and they have the part where you sew it onto your clothing. What I would do is I would cut that off with pliers and sand it down a little bit before I glued it onto paper. So it's nice, and well, it's not quite flat, but it's, you know, flatter. And then I've got some vintage lace here from our lace museum in Sunnyvale, close to where I live. This is a vintage envelope, stamped 1938. It's also a nice canceled stamp there. This is tied in onto the paper, and this is a metal piece glued on, I believe. Here is another doily crocheted. And what else do I have? Some lace, image from Ephemera's Vintage Garden, another button that has been cut and sanded so that it'll lay flat onto this piece of ribbon. This is Ephemera's Vintage Garden. This worked with putting a piece of ribbon and attaching this needle threader, which was my grandmother's, and I wanted to kind of highlight that. Another little photo and some pattern paper. This I made a button card out of a printout from Ephemera's Vintage Garden. I sewed the buttons onto there. You can see that. I also sewed this button, well, yeah, attached that button on and then put also the little bit of ribbon there, a little thread. This I used some eyelets to attach the ribbon on. This is a authentic postcard, though I stuck another canceled stamp up on this corner. I use a little bit of glitter on here. I don't really care for glitter that much, but it added something to the page, otherwise it was a little bit plain, on the plain side. This was in my grandmother's stash of things. I don't know what it is or what it's for, but I just put it in there along with another button card that I made with different buttons. And another button card on this side. These illustrated dresses came from a catalog from J. Peterman. And this is just kind of seam binding that was in my grandmother's things. This page I have not finished yet. I always hit this kind of project fatigue where I don't want to do any more, and I don't know if it's just because I don't want it to end or I just don't want to do any more. So anyway, I need to do one more spread before the book is actually finished. So my grandmother worked in the garment district in downtown Los Angeles at the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s. So this is a map of Los Angeles with just with a coat, because she worked for a coat factory. I think it was Robinson's company in downtown Los Angeles. Another picture of her, just with a little doily behind. And then this is the last page I used a cutout, and another picture of my grandmother. She was 102 when she passed away, and yeah. She was somebody I admired very much, and I know that she would like this book that I made for her. So anyway, if you have any questions, please post them and I will answer. Thank you.